Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today to the workshop, which is Introduction to Working with Eating Disorders. A little bit about me. So I trained in integrative psychotherapy in Derby in the UK. I was previously, based in Dubai, and now I'm back here. I trained in attachment theory, CBT, and person-centered approach. I also do some writing alongside my clinical work, and I've been working with eating disorders since the beginning of my training. To be very honest with you, when I started this work, I experienced a lot of feelings of incompetence. And that's why my goal for today is to really help practitioners feel confident in supporting those with eating disorders, or equally referring on and recognizing those, those signs and referring on to specialist services. So let's go into our agenda for today. We're going to look into the types of eating disorders. We're going to think of, some examples of what these eating disorders can look like. I also want to say that this presentation won't really help you diagnose eating disorders, but more so recognize and work with them. So there's a difference there. And we'll then look into interventions, what can we really do in the therapy room? And of course, at the end of it, we'll go into a Q&A. Bear with me. Yes. Right, so as we begin, the first thing that I guess one of the most important things we do as therapists and counselors is reflect. So I want us to think of, what really comes to mind when we think of those words, eating disorder and body image. You're free to, put some of that in the chat if you'd like, but, just starting to think of those words, what they mean to you. Have you seen that in your practice? Is there a personal connection to it? Things of that sort. So I'll just give a few minutes for that. Yeah, so let's move on to the next bit, which is, why are we here? Why are we learning about eating disorders? So this is a statistic that I found on the BBC about hospital admissions for under 20s during the pandemic. As you can see, the blue bars represent patients aged under 20, and you can see how much that's risen in 2020 given the pandemic. And this is why we're going to be seeing a lot of more, clients that are struggling with eating disorders. And to add to that, the total cost to the NHS associated with eating disorders is £1.26 billion annually. So, definitely something that that requires a lot more attention and, also funding we're seeing. And before we go into understanding the types of eating disorders, let's really understand what they are. So we've got a few words here that can really help us just think of, what that experience is like. So the first thing is preoccupation. This is preoccupation with food, weight, body image, and it's so, it's so consuming that it can be really hard for clients to focus on other aspects of their life. Eating disorders don't discriminate. So regardless of age, gender, ethnicity, race, you can experience an eating disorder. They're often seen as a coping mechanism as well. But what we see the most really is how control plays a role in eating disorders. When we think of the pandemic especially, lots of people felt out of control, not being able to go outdoors, not being able to meet people, meet their loved ones. So this kind of loss of control has actually, going back to that statistic, has made people really start to control the other aspects of their life. And when you can't control those things, it often becomes about food and body image. There's also a huge element of risk when we're working with this population. Eating disorders have the highest mortality rates among psychiatric disorders. And when we think of anorexia specifically, 1 in 5 deaths for anorexia can be linked to suicide. And with that, we'll move into learning about the different types of eating disorders. So the first one, as I mentioned earlier, is anorexia nervosa. So this is one that most of us might be familiar with, and we might have heard about it. If you look at the image over there, it is so clear that you can see that distorted body image. What comes to mind when I think of anorexia is that pursuit of thinness. Everything feels like it is about not gaining that weight or restricting food so that you don't gain that weight. And there's an intense fear as well of gaining weight, which can lead to using laxatives and really just denying how serious the problem is. You'll often see with clients that struggle with anorexia that what they see in the mirror, what they see as their body image, is so different to what you will be seeing or what anyone else that doesn't think the way that they do sees. So I know some therapists who will actually ask clients to draw out what they think, ask clients to draw out what the client thinks they look like, and oftentimes that is very, very different to what the real image there is. With anorexia, I think what can happen also is that we might see a lot of services reject clients when it comes to providing that support because they don't meet a certain BMI, and that can really, really make that denial of the seriousness of the problem worse. So we want to be careful of that, especially if we are providing a service that doesn't need to meet those criteria. Another risk with anorexia is that it can result in multi-organ failure as well. For all these disorders, I've tried to include some quotes just so that we can get a better understanding of what they look like for clients. So this is one, which is, I thought about food and calories all the time. I tried to avoid foods containing lots of fat or carbohydrates and only had safe foods, which I felt were okay to eat. To explain what safe foods means, it's a food that makes the client, that causes significantly less distress to the client. So, a safe food could be a Coke Zero, and a fear food could be a regular Coke because of the calories and the amount of sugar that's in it. Moving on, we've got binge eating disorder, which is actually one of the most common eating disorders, but also the least diagnosed. So this is about eating a large amount of food, even when one is not hungry. It's very much linked to emotions. And yet again, we see that sense of control, that loss of sense of control during those binges. These disorders, especially with binge eating disorder, can bring up a lot of shame because there is a negative connotation in our society, in our culture, to eating a lot, where oftentimes clients will try to eat in secret because that those feelings of shame can be really difficult to manage. We see binge eating disorder quite a bit in boys and men right now. That's what I'm seeing in my practice currently. But it's also good to see that people are seeking support for it. With eating disorders, you can see clients actually move from one diagnosis to another. Even if they don't have a diagnosis, they can move from kind of one, the symptoms can change quite quickly. So, someone that might be struggling with anorexia previously might actually, start to struggle with binge eating, but their idea of what a binge looks like can be very different to, someone that started out with binge eating disorder. So for someone with anorexia, eating 4 biscuits at a time can feel like a binge, and that can bring up extreme feelings of shame and guilt. So it's important to check in with our clients, what do they mean by a binge? What does that look like for them? And here's a quote as well. I would feel so shameful and guilty at any given moment about what I had eaten and how I felt in my body. And the worse I felt about myself, the more I ate and abused food. You can see here as well that that emotion is extremely linked to the amount that they eat. And there's also an all or nothing thinking style here where, even if you've eaten a little bit, it feels like failure. And that's when, the binge feels uncontrollable. Next, we have bulimia nervosa. The easiest way that I can explain this to you is that it's binge eating disorder with purging behaviors. So this could be throwing up, making yourself sick. Again, that loss of control. There's different ways that people might use purging behavior. So it can be use of laxatives. It can be, making yourself sick. There's really different ways of that. So when we work with those clients, it can be important to really think of what are their ways of purging, and also thinking of the impact of those purging behaviors, what it does to the body. And we see this a lot with eating disorders, that it doesn't just affect a person mentally, but it has a huge impact on your physical health as well. Some of you might be aware, but there was a movie recently called Spencer, which was about Princess Diana's life, who did suffer with bulimia. And, it was a great movie, I would say, in the way that they depicted bulimia. There are scenes of, the character making herself sick. If that's something that you feel you'd like to watch, I'd highly recommend it. It's called Spencer. And going into a quote then. So I used to go to the food cupboard, fridge or freezer and eat as much as I could, as quickly as possible, to try to make myself feel happier and fill the hole I felt inside. Afterwards, I felt physically and emotionally upset and guilty about all the food I had eaten, so I would make myself sick. You can see here that that feeling of guilt feels so heavy that it is physically impossible sometimes to keep the food inside you. And this is what people with bulimia suffer from quite a bit, because the emotional regulation is just so hard for them. And then lastly, we've got hika. So this is one that I don't think a lot of us are familiar with, but it's a very, very important one. This is a craving for non-food substances. And you've got examples here of paper, soap, paint, chalk, or ice. There is a massive risk involved here because of eating harmful substances. I've seen some research of pica showing up with people eating like nails, and really what that does to the digestive system. A really important example that I had learned on my training actually for pica was there was a case of family therapy actually, and the family was starting to notice after the death of a member that a particular chair was losing foam, that it was almost like parts of it were missing. And what they found out was that one of the members that was really impacted by the grief was consuming the foam of that chair, because that was the chair that the deceased member used to use, and that was their way of connecting with with the deceased. So it can really show up in different ways, but making sure that we take the time to explore what's really going on for someone that's experiencing pica can be really helpful. And this is what we've discussed right now, which is the types of eating disorders. What we'll go into next is how they present in people. So this is something I call something that we call the eating disorder iceberg, or the ED iceberg. When you see clients struggling with eating disorders, this is what's above water is what you can really see sometimes, which is the restriction, the purging, the calorie counting, that preoccupation with food, weight, body shape. But what's really going on underneath is what we want to work with. So that's the low self-esteem, perfectionism, attachment issues, a lot of anxiety. Anxiety is something that you will see with, if not most, if not almost eating disorder clients, and low mood as well, because of just how impactful this kind of illness can be. What we can add to that, underneath the water, is racism, colorism, internalized fat phobia, feelings of guilt, shame, gender dysphoria, possibly neurodivergence as well. We know that a lot of clients that struggle with eating disorders might also at some point get an autism diagnosis. And that's everything that we've discussed to understand the client. What can we do in the therapy room now with all of this? So we're going to go into interventions. The first thing I want to share is the scoff questionnaire. So this is how this is a great questionnaire to just understand if eating is something that is a concern for the client. What we might see in our therapy rooms is people might refer themselves for other things, and you might notice at some point that eating is a concern. This is where we can ask really specific questions about whether they make themselves sick, that loss of control, which is very important, changes in our weight. I say this, I think it's so important to say this time and again, is that you don't want to reiterate to clients that they have to be a certain weight, BMI, or they have to look a certain way to be able to have a diagnosis or even receive support for eating disorders. Services will do that constantly, which makes clients feel like they have to be ill enough to receive support. And that can be incredibly damaging because it just fuels the eating disorder. Especially for someone with anorexia, if you tell them that your weight isn't low enough to receive support, that's just going to fuel that kind of competitiveness of, right, I need to be the person that can receive the support, and I need to start restricting even more to actually get help. And that last question about whether food dominates their life, and really understanding that preoccupation. So that can be kind of the first step of identifying what they might be dealing with. Next, we've got these really important questions, ones that I think I heard a lot on my training, but I don't think that I felt confident enough to ask them as directly as they might, seem. The first question is, when was the first time you felt out of control? This can be a really, really heavy question for clients sometimes because, they've never thought about control in their life in the way that, a counselor or a therapist might see it. It can also be a really difficult question for young people. As a child and a young person, you often don't have much control. You're having to do things around, you're having to do things that the adult caregivers around you say that you need to do. So really allowing that time and space for clients to be able to answer that question and feel comfortable in opening up to you about that. This next question is, what emotion are you eating? With this client group, and I think with most clients, we see that their emotional vocabulary might not be as developed. This is a great opportunity to do that. Asking them to, the next time they're going to have a meal, or the next time they're going to, they think about food, what is the emotion that they're experiencing with that? Are they eating sadness, loneliness, shame? It can start some really interesting discussions around what the client is actually experiencing, and is food a coping mechanism for that, for dealing with that emotion. Next, we have an ED timeline. The way that I do this is I work in kind of chunks of 5 years, so 0 to 5, 6 through 10, and so on. an ED timeline is something that it doesn't even have to be specific to eating disorders, but something that you can do with clients to identify the origin story of, of where their difficulties started. So I've condensed this one particularly, but you can simply ask them, what are the significant experiences that come to mind for you when you think of ages 0 to 5, 6 to 10 onwards? This is one that I've come up with for a client that might have started to struggle with eating because of the lockdown and the pandemics. The lockdowns. We've got, at age 10, a parent joins Weight Watchers, which makes you think of the language around the home. So food becomes a concern, weight becomes a concern, and that language is, something that they're listening to at a very young age. And you've got at age 15, we have, the pandemic. So there's multiple lockdowns, which means that they have more time on their hands and there's increased social media use. Now, what's happening on social media during, lockdown? It's a lot of fitness content. And this is where they start to restrict because they need to live up to these, often unattainable fitness goals. We go to age 18 where, clients starting to apply for universities, and they get rejected from the university of their choice, which might lead to extreme feelings of failure. Again, there is often that all or nothing thinking there. So that feeling of failure feels so difficult to manage, that they start to binge to cope with those emotions, to cope with that, that loss of what they had imagined life to be. Age 21, they might start taking relationships a bit more seriously, and comments from people that they're interested in can be really impactful. So hearing something like "you're not my type" can be interpreted as "you're not my size." When you think of the binging starting around age 18 through 21, that's 3 years where they might have gained some weight, they might not feel as good in their body, and that's when they start to purge. So you can see how they move from perhaps one diagnosis to another, or just one kind of eating difficulty to another, given these environmental factors. And we've got just 2 more interventions left. Psychoeducation on social media. So I think the understanding often is that social media only impacts young people, and I think that's completely untrue. Eating disorders don't discriminate. You will see people struggling with an eating disorder regardless of age, and it is often fueled by social media as well. ITV recently came out with a report saying that 80% of TikTok users surveyed said that the app hindered their eating disorder recovery. We also live in a time of beauty overstimulation where these apps and these, have a bias for beauty. Again, beauty that's decided by the app and the kind of artificial intelligence there. So regardless of what content you're interested in, what's being pushed, on most people's accounts is content that really is focuses on beauty, or on people that kind of match that criteria for the algorithm. But being on social media can really increase that, fuel that critical voice that clients often hear. We call it the ED voice, or the critical voice, which is a voice that's constantly critiquing you, telling you you're not good enough, that you need to do more. So being aware of how much of your client's life is impacted by social media. What are they following? And I think the suggestion often can be that, why don't you start following content of people that have different sizes and body shapes? And I think sometimes that can be incredibly counterintuitive, because you're still making the focus someone's body weight. So just being mindful of the content that they consume. Lastly, we've got mindful eating. So this is just engaging all 5 of your senses and slowing down that eating process. it can be helpful in session really to ask your clients, what's your favorite meal, or what's a meal that you usually have, and going over those questions with them so that they feel prepared to do that outside of the session. It can, start up some really interesting discussions about their favorite meal as well, the memories attached to them, seeing that from an attachment lens of, the loss that they might feel because they're not able to have that meal anymore because now it doesn't feel like a safe food. So those kind of things. And as we come to the end, so the key takeaways for today is, when you work with this client, you think of control. Can you give the client control in a healthy way? Is it, working around a time that suits them? Asking them if this feels right for them, the support that they're receiving, telling them that, they can leave. This is, client autonomy is the heart of the therapeutic relationship as well, where if this doesn't feel right for you, you can leave. So giving them that sense of control, being mindful of that iceberg. You might think that you don't know how to work with eating disorders, but you probably know how to work with everything that's underneath the water. And the last thing is, I call it the to be or not to be, but with eating disorders, clients are having to speak about it a lot, going through assessments for services, that sometimes they reach a point where they don't want to talk about it anymore. So finding that balance of addressing the eating disorder itself, so the behaviors surrounding it, and also, the iceberg. But yes, that is all for today. We will go into a Q&A. I just want to share, I just want to say thank you to everyone. It's been really nice to have you all here. And, if you want to follow me or, get in touch with me, that would be great.